Okay. Introductions of Dr. Eric Hake. He teaches economics at Catawba College here in Salisbury. Now, come on up here, Eric, while I'm talking here. Now, he's going to talk about inflation. And I was trying to think about this a little bit. I remember what it was like to inflate the bike tire on my bike. You know, I could pump it up and it was inflated. And over the years, I've gotten to know people who have highly inflated egos. But you deal with something a little bit more strange and mysterious. And kind of up here, you know, kind of sort of theoretical sort of stuff, except when we go to the grocery store. And so, good luck in trying to explain all this stuff to us. But it obviously is very, very important for our life together, for politics together. There's all kinds of other stuff going on as well politically, but we need to hear from Eric to try to make sense out of what it is to live in a world affected by inflation. Eric Hake, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction there, and it's great to see you guys today, and I do hope that I'm going to be able to explain a little bit about inflation at a level that everyone can understand. I actually think it is not that difficult to understand, but you be the judge of that, I guess. And what I've tried to do, and I do want to apologize before I get started that I have to run right off. As a college professor, I pretty much don't have a large number of obligations in the summertime, and I was surprised to find that the two obligations of this week fell at the same time, essentially. So I am going to have to run off. So I am sorry I won't be able to stay around because I'd be happy. As my wife knows, I only have one favorite subject, which is economics, and anytime anyone is willing to talk to me about it, I am always willing to talk about economics. And inflation is an important subject in economics. It definitely does affect how we live and our lifestyles, and what I've tried to do, since I knew I wouldn't be here, I wanted to go ahead and provide some notes, and Ken has passed around copies of that so that you could have something to look at and review. And if you do have any other questions, you want to talk about it some more, as I said, I'm always happy to entertain questions and conversation about subjects like this, because it is about how we survive. So please feel free to get in touch with me. My Catawba email address is probably the easiest way. I'm not so good with the cell phones. So what I've tried to do is provide some of the details about what's going on with inflation right now, so that we do have some materials that you could look at and think about. And then some observations about what is causing inflation and how we respond as a society. What are the policy responses to that? So I started out providing just some charts here. These come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is responsible for accumulating the data. And in the first chart, we can see 4 measures of inflation. We have inflation in all items. That is the headline number, which you frequently hear repeated in the news, of 8.3% inflation as of April 2022. And that's a year-long measurement, a 12-month percentage change. In food and energy, notoriously volatile places for price changes, we have 9.4% inflation in the food category, 30.3% inflation in the energy category. And because all items include the food and the energy, we also frequently have another statistic that you will see, which is called core inflation in the newspapers or in the reports, and that is all items except for food and energy. That inflation rate as of April 2022 is running at about 6.2%. Now, just as you can take out food and energy out of the calculation of inflation, you can break it down into a lot of other things, right? And break out all of the categories. So I provided some data about the different categories, and these aren't all the categories that are included. It's kind of interesting. Inflation is a single number which reflects the overall change in the price level for all goods and services. And the way that we get that number is by going out and measuring prices. Catawba College actually provides a cost of living study for Rowan County that is used by Rowan Economic Development Commission. And so you really just go around, you pick up a shopping cart, you buy your things, put them all in a basket and see what the price is. Then you do that every month or every year, and the next time you go out, put the exact same things in this is called a fixed weighted basket. Put all the same things in the cart and look at what the price is. And if the price is different, well, you put the same things in the cart each time, so the difference must be the change in prices. Interestingly enough, we want to talk about inflation as a great big thing, the whole prices of all, the average prices of all things. But when we then want to understand what's happening, we want to break it apart again. So that is the process of aggregation, putting it all together, all of the different prices, and then disaggregation, breaking it back out to find out what's driving it. And clearly food and energy prices are driving what is happening. Now, inflation is not the same thing as a change in the price of a single good, right? If you have a change, say, steak becomes more expensive, but chicken becomes cheaper, you don't say that you're having inflation in steak prices. You just say that that's a change in the price of steak. The only way that we get to the word inflation, or the idea of inflation, is when we're having all prices everywhere, on average, rising. And we have been experiencing inflation. We've been experiencing inflation since about April of 2021. So as I said here, inflation is usually reported as an annual rate, while that is collected on a monthly level. And I describe what headline inflation is and core inflation. Both headline and core inflation have been rising since April of 2021. Given some of the things that have been going on in the economy, we originally thought, not too much to worry about yet, but it has become, in terms of the monthly data, it has become kind of persistent. So we're seeing it now, and the policy is going to be responding, and policy actions have already been taken in order to reduce inflation. Interestingly enough, we don't have, right, if people think inflation is bad, if you go out and you go shopping, you notice every month that the price of buying groceries is rising, people say, well, inflation is eating away at the value of my money, right? That is what inflation does. And that can be harder and harder unless your incomes also rise. You can't keep up with inflation. That is usually thought of as a bad thing. So you would think that our society and our government would want to have 0% inflation. But we don't. That is not actually our goal. Our goal in the current environment since the 1980s has been to have a target inflation rate of 2%. The reason that we don't have a 0% inflation target is because, if you think about it, as I just described it, now if I get music while I'm in class, that gives me an opportunity to dance. And my students have found very quickly that they don't want to see me attempt to break dance. And so that usually only happens once or twice at the beginning of the semester, which is unfortunate for me because I love to dance. With the, I just can't help it, the music moves me. What can I say? As we said, that inflation rate is an average, right? The average of all prices are rising. So if you had a 0% inflation rate, that would mean half of all prices were rising, but the other half of all prices were falling, right? And while we frequently concern ourselves with the problem of inflation, there is a worse problem to have, and that is called deflation. And deflation is when prices are all falling, negative inflation rates. There have been, so if you don't like inflation, you say, man, why don't we have 0% inflation, or why don't we have negative inflation? Wouldn't that be good? Unfortunately, in economics, we usually like to say there are good things and there are bad things. And in the case of changes in the price level, there are just bad things and badder things, right? Inflation is what we are used to. Low, moderate, steady inflation is what we try to shoot for because we do not want to experience deflation. There have been no healthy episodes of true deflation in any industrialized economy. The only example we have in America where it was clearly, definitively deflation was the Great Depression. 1929 to 1933, the average price level fell by about a third. Right? So, we don't want to have deflation. We want to have a healthy rate of inflation, an acceptable rate that we can manage. We don't want to have accelerating inflation, which is currently 6 and 8%. That is a little too high for us. But we have, so that is the reason that we have a target of 2% inflation. Now, where does inflation come from? As Jeffrey was pointing out, inflation from a tire and inflated egos. I'm not going to be able to use either of those metaphors, unfortunately, but I am going to be able to use a basic principle of economics, which is the idea of supply and demand, right? We all can accept that market economies, which we are all a part of, and allows us to pursue our jobs and our incomes and then be able to buy things from other people. That is really what our society does in a market economy. You have to have people produce things to sell things, and you have to have people demand things or buy things. And out of those two forces of supply and demand, you create a price. The person who supplies chickens produces a certain number of chickens. People who buy the chickens, between the forces of supply and demand, you create a price for chickens. That's what's happening in all markets all the time. The interaction of supply and demand. We can call that, when we talk about total supply, we can call it aggregate supply. When we talk about total demand for all goods and services, we can call that total or aggregate demand. So how does inflation get involved there? There are two things that can cause inflation. You could have too much demand. In the entire economy, there could be more people trying to buy everything that is available and not enough of those goods being produced and provided. And that would then cause the prices to go up on average for all prices. In the case of housing right now, we could see inflation in that sector. For all housing, we do refer to that with inflation. And right now, we're seeing that there is a lot of demand to buy houses with not a lot of supply. Something happened in 2008. Contractors don't want to build houses as much as they used to because they all went bankrupt. So in the case of inflation, there's too much. In the case of housing, there's been all of this demand for housing, not enough houses being supplied, and so we're seeing housing prices increase very dramatically. So, too much demand. And we use the phrase demand pull inflation to describe that. There could be rising, the other primary cause of inflation would be not enough supply. Right? Supply shortages, supply constraints. I'm fortunate enough to have been able to live outside of the United States for a while. I had a job, that's the easiest way to do that thing. And working and living overseas, I became accustomed to the idea that some days the electricity doesn't work, which is kind of like a nice forced vacation for everybody. Everybody just goes home. The water's not running today, time to go take a nap, right? Americans have not been used to experiencing shortages of things where we actually see our ability to consume goods and services shut off for whatever reason. Just in the last year, we have experienced gas shortages where there were queues for gas lines as a result of something happened with a pipeline. We have seen COVID and COVID bottlenecks in production of a large number of things. We're right now discussing a baby food, right? The baby formula shortages nationwide, right? Americans are not used to these things, right? But they do happen very frequently. And if you don't have enough supply, but people still want to buy those things, that will cause inflation. How'd that work? Jeffrey?
Much better than a tire pump.
Okay, all right. Right? So you can have too much demand or too little supply. Now, just like I talked about inflation, if we want to figure out what's causing inflation, we can break it apart and look at these disaggregated pieces of information I provided on my first page. We can do the same thing when we talk about inflation and the causes of inflation. We recognize that it's a result of markets, but we can break it apart into the forces of supply and analyze what's happening in supply. And we can then break it apart and analyze what's happening in the areas of demand. So that's how you put it all together. Oh, that's a problem. What's wrong? Break it apart. I like to work on machines. When there's a problem with a machine, with an automobile, with a motorcycle engine, break it apart, look at it, figure it out. So I have two economists here that I've mentioned, John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman. They have very different theories about what causes inflation. But because we are here talking about the policy implications of this and the politics of it, I wanted to mention these two economists, John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman. These are the two most famous economists of the 20th century. John Maynard Keynes is the most important economist of the first half of the 20th century. Milton Friedman, the most important economist of the second half of the 20th century. John Maynard Keynes was essentially the primary theorist of what we consider to be the New Deal in America and European managed capitalism of the early 20th century. The idea that there is a role for the government to provide basic social safety net, the idea that we need to regulate systems like finance, the idea that it is possible to manage our economy so that all can achieve opportunity. Those are all ideas that were developed with John Maynard Keynes. And his point about inflation was sometimes, like in the Great Depression, you can have all the factories shuttered, you can have supplies and raw materials and everything laying around, and still nobody has a job. 25% unemployment, 30% unemployment, as it was in the Great Depression. And he pointed out that under those conditions of excess supply, a lot of stuff that's not being used, the government can step in and ensure that people have incomes and provide relief to them, like the COVID relief package, and let people buy things. And you can do that, and it can improve everybody's circumstance without causing inflation. Remember, because the key there is that there's extra supply. Now, the ideas of John Maynard Keynes not relied upon nearly as much in the later 20th century and the 21st century. To that goes a gentleman, Milton Friedman, from the University of Chicago. And to paraphrase Nixon, who once said, "We are all Keynesians now." He said that in 1971. And apparently everybody hated Nixon so much that nobody wanted to be a Keynesian anymore. So once Nixon said he was a Keynesian, nobody else wanted to be a Keynesian. The end of Keynesianism. I would like to say that now, the way our current economy is managed is a great deal more like Milton Friedman. And so I will paraphrase Nixon and say we are all monetarists now. The way that we try to manage our economy, the idea of having a social safety net, government programs, providing relief, ensuring that workers have an opportunity, that has been out the window, unfortunately, in a lot of economic policy for America, beginning with the Reagan Revolution, right? In the 1980s. We've been pushing against that since then. And Milton Friedman argued that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And he provided a very simple recipe for how to get rid of inflation. We have been using that recipe very effectively since 1980. The way to get rid of inflation, according to Milton Friedman, is cut the money supply. Take away the money, and people will not have enough demand to buy the goods and services that are available, right? And so inflation will begin to ease out of the economy. And that is exactly what we are doing today under Jerome Powell's Federal Reserve, right? We are not dealing with any of the hardships associated with inflation. We are simply cutting the money supply, taking away money so that there is less total aggregate demand so that we can bleed inflation out of the economy. The last time we did this, well, we've been doing this regularly since the 1980s. The best example of when we did that was under Paul Volcker, 1979 to 1981, in which he crushed the inflation of the 1970s. The real problem with this approach to getting rid of inflation is that it causes a recession, right? So that's what we're playing with under our current economic policies. One of the reasons, one of the responses that we have, realizing that we have never successfully gotten rid of inflation without having a recession. Because the chairman of the Federal Reserve is aware of that, and we know that, this is the reason you'll hear people talking in the news about a soft landing. We want to soft land the economy and get rid of inflation without causing a recession. Maybe we'll get to do it this time, right? I don't know. We haven't had a great track record on that, right? Now, if you look at what is happening, right, with the levels of inflation and our management of the economy under monetarism, I would argue that John Maynard Keynes actually had a better understanding of how to manage the economy than Milton Friedman. This means I am mostly unemployable. Right? I'm very grateful to my employer to allow me to come and talk about this sort of thing, but most of us that are Keynesian or believe that Keynes had a lot to say, we were removed, right, in the 1980s and 1990s when I was trying to get a job, and many of my colleagues were trying to get jobs. So economists are kind of like biker gangs, right? The key is you don't really change the mind of an economist once they've been educated. All you can do is make sure they don't come on your turf. Biker wars, that's the way I look at the way economists manage themselves.
Don't make them mad.
It's pretty accurate, pretty accurate. So what have we been doing with the economy in terms of inflation since the 1980s? We have realized that we can very effectively get rid of inflation by grinding the poor and making it harder for people to get ahead. And that is what we have been doing consistently since the 1980s. Unfortunately, one of the things that Milton Friedman didn't think we needed to do was to regulate the financial system. So we removed much of the controls that had been put in place in the Great Depression and let the financial system do whatever it wanted to. That is called financial innovation. We're all now, hopefully, if you're lucky enough, you're invested in the stock market. We're all a part of this game now, right? If you're lucky, you get to play the game. As they say about the state North Carolina lottery, if you don't play, you can't win, right? So you need to play that game. But beginning in 2000, we began to experience a series of financial crises in the American economy that had already been experienced elsewhere. We had the 1997 Asian financial crisis. The two that hit America, though, were the stock market bubble in 2000 and the real estate bubble that burst in 2008. Better luck next time. This is a little better than the Great Depression, because in the Great Depression, one of the reasons it was great, not so great, make America not so great again. The Great Depression, we had both a stock market bubble and a real estate bubble that burst in the same year, in 1929. Both of those things happened and the banking system collapsed. Since 2000 and 2008, our primary goal in managing the money supply of the U.S. economy has been to ensure that our financial system did not collapse. We have let it do whatever it wanted to do. We have lowered interest rates to the bottom dollar, 0%. This has been a historic period of time, particularly after 2008. We have not had an episode of 0% interest rates in the U.S. economy in history prior to 2008. We did that in order to make sure that the financial system didn't collapse. And what did they do with the money? Stock buybacks. They didn't really grow investment. They didn't really provide us a better infrastructure for our society. I'm kind of irritated about that.
Yeah, too.
Right? By holding interest rates so low for so long, what we are doing is trying to get inflation. We have been trying to create inflation a little bit more because we haven't been able to hit our inflation targets reliably of 2% since 2000. Particularly after 2008, we got a couple months, a couple whiffs of deflation. And that would be truly terrifying, right? So we've actually been doing everything we can to have a little more inflation. Unfortunately, with the COVID pandemic, our attempts to stimulate the economy through lower interest rates, more aggregate demand, the expansion of aggregate demand to stimulate the economy, to get a little healthy inflation going on, has run into a roadblock of a collapse of supply chains. Remember I talked about the causes of inflation? I said too much demand or not enough supply. We've got a little bit of both and a whole lot of the collapse of supply chains, to the extent that we're experiencing shortages in the U.S. economy that we've never seen before. Now, the various factors that I've got here, there are a large number of things, right? So since 2000 stock market bubble and 2008 real estate bubble, we've been using loose monetary policy to lower interest rates, inflate the stock and bond market, and keep the economy from a deflationary episode. At the same time, we've been trying to bump up aggregate demand and stimulate investment with large deficits and large deficit fiscal spending. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden have all passed major legislation. Some of it's going to be a little nicer to the business community, right, with tax cuts and investment breaks, like Trump's privatization of the social infrastructure bill, right? I can't remember what he called it. Or some of them are going to be a little more targeted to the frontline workers, people who are under the most hardship, and try to give them the resources to be able to pay their monthly rent and keep food on the table. Right? But all of those cause an increase in aggregate demand. We've been very good at increasing the aggregate demand for speculative assets. In terms of real estate and stock markets, we've had incredible real estate and stock markets for the last 10 years. We've been pumping them up. Apparently we pumped them up too much. And now we're going to cut them out. Right? So we're already experiencing a stock market decline and a bond market decline. And that is a part of what is happening as a result of our efforts to fight inflation. We've begun to see that the housing market is finally cooling off a little bit in the summer of 2022 after ridiculous increases in housing prices, right? My wife and I are now playing a game. We go on Zillow and say, can you believe what this house sold for? Right? No, I can't freaking believe that. That's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
If I'd like to buy a trailer in Rowan County, I'd have to pay more money than I bought my house for.
Yeah. That's true.
That is true. So in terms of looking at the causes of inflation, we have the stock market, or the loose monetary policy and large deficit fiscal policies that are the drivers there. But there are a lot of other things that have been going on as well. As I mentioned, demand pull inflation. Most recent episode that's causing, it's going to be used politically unfortunately, is that the idea of giving relief to people in the face of COVID caused inflation. You're already hearing the ad campaigns, right? I guess it would have been better to let people die,
Yeah.
right?
So,
Yeah. So we've also seen rising wages, right? In the face of COVID, many people realize that they are now called frontline workers if you work in a grocery store. And in the fast food industry, a lot of people said, this job is not worth dying for, right? So we had episodes where entire shifts of workers just quit, right? Well, how do you get them back? Pay them a little more money. Unfortunately, that will be used politically to say, the workers are getting uppity. Right? Time to give them a good recession, and then they'll be happy again, just to have a job. That's that COVID benefit, right? If you're going to go back to work, I call that a risk of death premium that more people are expecting if they're doing that work, right? We've had supply chain issues, and I'm going to have to walk out the door, unfortunately. Supply chain issues, where those disruptions have caused by the COVID pandemic. We've had the Ukrainian-Russian conflict that has had an impact on food. Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe for a reason, as well as the energy markets with the Russian war. We have corporate power. Robert Reich is a very well-known proponent of describing what we're seeing right now as profit taking and raising of prices to benefit those firms, right? So their profits are up. And then we also have the availability of credit, that unregulated financial system that I described. We have already begun to fight inflation. We have raised interest rates twice. We had interest rates at 0.25%. We raised it to 0.5 in April or March. And then we raised it again by a half percentage point to 1%, which is still, that's been really low. 1%. And this is going to have the effect of cooling off the economy and getting rid of inflation. And we'll continue to raise interest rates until the inflation is gone. So I do not blame the COVID relief package, right, for the political analysis that is frequently being applied today to put all this at the foot of worker relief in the face of supply shortages, I think is brazen politics, right? And there are a lot of other things that have gone to contribute the current rate of inflation. Thank you very much. I got to roll.